Hey guys, tonight we will be telling the story of Anne of Cleves, the woman who became the fourth wife of Henry VIII, lived in that marriage for only 6 months, yet went on to spend 17 more years of her life in peace, comfort, and freedom. The main story tonight is not about romance, not about beauty, but about how a person escaped the whirlpool of power and cruelty through quiet wisdom and won by stepping away at exactly the right moment. Anne did not argue, did not resist, did not fight against fate. She simply understood something others never realized. Sometimes survival is the rarest form of victory, and history whispers about it instead of celebrating it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And before we begin, tell me this. Where are you in the world, and what time is it where you're watching from? I always love the feeling of someone listening from Texas, New York, Florida, and then someone else in Oregon, Virginia, or Minnesota, slowly drifting into sleep in a completely different time zone. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your Majesty, do you know what strikes my nose whenever she enters the room? Not the scent of roses, but something like a barrel of dead fish left to rot beneath the sundae. That was how they spoke of Anne of Cleves later. They called her the Flanders mare. The ugly wife the king rejected, the fortunate one who escaped with her life. Those whispers drifted through the corridors of court life, clinging longer than truth ever could, sharper than memory itself. But tonight, if you settle deeper beneath your blanket and let your breathing soften, I want to tell you another version. The story of a woman who crossed a winter sea to marry a king she had never seen, who remained his wife for only 6 months, and then lived 17 more years in quiet peace, while that same king died, surrounded by the stench of his own decaying flesh. Anne was 24 years old. All her life she had been trained to believe that marriage was politics, a duty to forge alliances, to produce heirs, to stand silently behind a powerful man. The portrait Holbein sent to England showed a ruler who looked strong, youthful, commanding. She did not know that in reality Henry was nearly 50, swollen with weight and age, plagued by a leg ulcer that never stopped weeping, and tormented by disappointment and fear of failure. She did not know he was terrified of repeating what he called the disaster of Anne. On the ship rocking through the fierce December winds, Anne tried only not to faint, not to collapse, not to lose herself before reaching English soil. Her German ladies wept and prayed, clutching their beads, trembling at every wave. Anne gripped the wooden wall, steadying herself, thinking of the future already written for her becoming Queen of England, bearing sons, fulfilling duty. She did not know that only days after meeting her, the king would decide he was repulsed, and from that moment forward, the court, the law, and even the idea of truth itself would bend to please him. So tonight, as you listen with slow breaths and heavy eyelids, picture a young woman crossing a winter channel, her heart tight with worry, yet still holding on to hope. She did not know she had stepped into a game whose rules she could never change, and that she had already lost before her feet ever touched English ground. To understand why Anne fell into that trap, we have to turn back 6 months. At that time, in the cold stone corridors of the English court, Thomas Cromwell, the right hand of Henry, was calculating. He was the man who had helped Henry break from Rome, dissolve the monasteries, and both raise and destroy Anne Boleyn. He survived because he always knew what the king wanted before the king himself said it. In this moment, Henry wanted something painfully simple and dangerously complicated. A new wife. A woman to replace Jane Seymour, who had died after giving birth to a son. A marriage that would strengthen England's alliance with the Protestant states of Germany, creating balance against France and Spain. And if she happened to be beautiful, making him feel young and desired again all the better. Cromwell looked at the map of Europe and stopped at Cleves, a small duchy aligned with the new faith, positioned strategically. The Duke had 2 unmarried sisters, Anne and Amalia. Rumours said both were acceptable. But rumours were not enough to stake Cromwell's life on. He needed a face the king would fall in love with, and so Hans Holbein, master of portraiture, was sent to Germany. Holbein understood that a royal portrait was not meant to reflect truth, but to sell a dream. He studied Anne carefully, turning her beneath shifting light, searching for angles that softened the length of her face and the sharpness of her nose. He chose a 3/4 pose, a deep red gown embroidered with gold, jewellery that looked costly but not ostentatious. Her hands folded calmly, her eyes solemn, without a smile, because a smile could betray imperfections. He did not paint Anne as she moved awkwardly. He did not paint the rigid German tone of her speech. He did not paint her under harsh sunlight or laughing with her real teeth exposed. He painted the best possible version of a German noblewoman, composed, modest, suitable to be a queen. When the portrait was carried back to England and unveiled before Henry, the king gazed at it for a long time. He did not merely see a woman. He saw possibility a gentle princess who would admire him, bear more sons, and patch the wounds left after the tragedy of Anne Boleyn. And within a few days he said, yes. No one told Anne that from that moment forward she was no longer herself. She was only the painted version, and real life rarely wins against pigment and varnish. The negotiations accelerated. Letters crossed borders. Dates were set. Gifts were exchanged. And while diplomats smiled, the truth remained quietly waiting. Henry had fallen in love with a painting, not a woman. Holbein returned to England, his work praised. Cromwell exhaled, believing he had secured both a queen and his own continued power. The court buzzed with whispers, wagers, anticipation. The people dreamt of stability, heirs, and peace. Only one person was still unaware of the script being written in her name. Anne. She was preparing, dutifully learning English customs, practicing curtsies, packing gowns. She did not know that she would soon be judged, not by who she was, but by how closely she resembled a wooden panel carried across the sea. In Cleves, snow gathered at the edges of the courtyard. The air smelled of pine and frost. Anne wrapped herself in heavy winter fabric, believing she was stepping into honour, believing she was chosen because she was worthy, believing she would be welcomed as a bride. But across the channel, Henry was rehearsing a fantasy. And fantasies are fragile things. They crack the moment reality steps into the room. The treaty was sealed. The ships were prepared. And the world moved forward, as though destiny itself had spoken. Yet destiny had nothing to do with it. A brush did. A painter did. A man who feared losing power did. And so Anne began her journey, not realizing she was walking into a story where her failure had already been written, not by God, not by fate, but by men holding parchment, ink, and ambition. She had been chosen because a king liked a portrait. And portraits never warn you about the moment a king changes his mind. Anne's ship reached shore in the freezing wind. She stepped onto English soil, her body still swaying with the rhythm of the waves. They arranged for her to rest at Rochester Castle, a fortress of cold stone, full of draughts and echoing corridors, nothing like the warm residences of Cleves. To entertain the future bride, the English prepared a pastime they believed exciting, bull baiting. Anne stood at the window looking down into the courtyard. The bull was chained, the dogs lunged, and blood spattered across the ground. The German ladies whispered in horror, their hands pressed to their lips. But Anne kept her face calm, because that was what was expected of a future queen. Endure in silence. At that same moment, a group of men in rough brown wool entered the chamber without announcement. Leading them was a large man with flushed cheeks and strange eyes, but his clothing showed nothing regal. To Anne, such a man could only be a merchant or a minor official. She nodded politely, then turned back toward the spectacle in the yard, the entertainment her hosts had prepared for her. The man was Henry. He was playing his favourite game, disguising himself and appearing suddenly before his bride-to-be, waiting for a moment of true love, a moment in which she would recognize him without golden cloak, fall to her knees, and tremble with joy. But nothing happened. His future bride continued watching the bull toss the dogs. Henry stood there waiting, his breath tightening. His courtiers exchanged glances, sensing danger. At last he turned and stormed out of the room like a thundercloud pressed into human form. A while later, he returned, this time with attendants, formal ceremony, cloak, jewels, and the shouted announcement of King Henry VIII. Anne knelt, spoke the greetings she had memorized, and performed every gesture correctly. But in Henry's mind, none of it erased the earlier moment. She had not recognized him when he wished to be recognized. That night, while Anne went to bed believing she had done reasonably well, Cromwell was summoned at midnight. Henry paced back and forth, his voice thick with disgust. "I like her not. She does not resemble her picture. Is there any way to avoid this marriage?" Cromwell understood. The treaty was signed, Anne was already in England, and all of Europe was watching. The wedding could not be cancelled without provoking diplomatic chaos. But Henry left him with words colder than the wind outside the castle walls. "If you cannot fix this, there will be consequences." Cromwell departed with a heart heavy as stone. Anne slept, believing everything was still moving in the right direction. Outside, the waves beat against the shore. The castle groaned in the winter winds. The English court exhaled uneasily, sensing something shifting beneath the surface. Anne dreamed of a crown, unaware that Henry dreamed of escape. The German ladies whispered prayers under their breath, hands clutching blankets, sensing misfortune without understanding it. Henry stared into the darkness, resentment growing like frost. Cromwell sat awake, ink drying on untouched parchment, knowing that a king's displeasure could strip titles, lands, and life in a single stroke. Nothing had officially gone wrong, and yet everything had. A single moment of unrecognized royalty had cracked the delicate fantasy that held the alliance together. Morning would come, and the wedding day would draw near, because treaties did not care about disappointment, and politics did not care about revulsion. But something silent and irreversible had already happened. Henry felt mocked, and a king who feels mocked is a storm that thinks the world owes it lightning. Anne would smile, perform, curtsy, and continue forward, unaware that the ground beneath her was already shifting. Henry would brood, remembering the moment she looked past him. Cromwell would work feverishly, knowing his life depended on repairing what could not be repaired. And all of it began because a woman looked out a window at a chained bull, while a king stood behind her wanting to be adored. The sea had carried Anne to England, but it could not carry her back. The treaty held her in place. The court watched. The wind whispered through the stone arches like a warning too soft to hear, and somewhere in the distance, fate exhaled, slow, cold, and inevitable. On the morning of the 6th of January, in the year 1540, Anne was awakened before dawn had the chance to lift the veil of night. Servants dragged in a wooden bath, steam rising, the faint scent of herbs drifting through the cold air. Her hair was washed, combed, braided, and pinned beneath the heavy German headdress. Undergarments, then outer layers, and finally the gown woven with gold thread dazzling to look at, yet heavy as a cage. When she entered the chapel at Greenwich, the space shimmered with candlelight and stained glass. Henry stood there, robed in gold and red. They walked side by side, stood together, and spoke vows that Anne only recognized as sounds, not meaning. The ring slipped a little loose around her finger, and when the final prayer ended, on parchment, she had become Queen of England. But in Henry's hand, she felt only distance, cold and metallic. Throughout the feast, he laughed with others, drank wine, told jokes, and filled the hall with noise, while Anne sat beside him, receiving translations of every sentence, forcing herself to smile at the appropriate moments. Roasted meats, sugared pastries, wine, music, and dancing, all of it swirling around a pair who did not exchange even a single meaningful glance. When night came, attendants carefully guided them to the marriage bed. Anne was stripped layer by layer before unfamiliar women and placed upon the bed like a wax figure. Henry appeared in a white nightshirt, his left leg wrapped in bandages, the smell of medicine and leaking pus thick in the air. The bed shook when he climbed onto it. Courtiers joked, offered wishes for many sons, and then the door shut. The two were left in silence. Anne had been taught that a husband would do what must be done. She lay still, waiting. Henry, exhausted, aching, and haunted by his age and failing body, touched her, attempted a kiss, tried to force himself to fulfill the duty expected of a king, but his body betrayed him. Nothing happened. At last he turned away, silent. No explanation, no comfort. Anne lay awake in the darkness, eyes wide, unsure whether this was normal in marriage or not. The next morning, Henry spoke not to his wife, but summoned physicians, telling them that her body was like that of a woman who has borne many children, and that there was a foul smell like dead fish, and they recorded every word. Anne sat with her ladies, smiling faintly when they asked how the night had gone, unable to find a single word for the emptiness. The pattern repeated. Days passed, and each morning Henry complained to others, never to her. Each night Anne lay in silence, Each sunrise carried the weight of something unspoken, something wrong, something tightening like a rope around the future. Henry told more advisers that nothing had happened in the marriage bed. He blamed her appearance, her manner, the way she seemed foreign, distant, unfamiliar. But the records show something different. They show a king frightened of impotence, frightened of age, frightened of failure. And fear has a way of reshaping truth. Anne continued performing her role, greeting visitors, learning courtly gestures, practicing English phrases. She believed that in time, things would settle, that affection could grow, that duty could become comfort. But the court had already begun whispering. Servants noticed Henry's disgust. Ambassadors wrote home in coded letters. Cromwell felt the floor shifting beneath him, and yet Anne remained unaware. She walked through the palace like a candle placed in a draught upright, steady but flickering without knowing why. She tried to be pleasant, obedient, calm. She tried to please a man who had already rewritten reality in his mind. She tried to find footing in a place where even the truth bowed to a king's humiliation. The marriage existed only on paper. In the bed, there was distance. In the hall, there was performance. In the court, there was tension. And in Henry's mind, there was a growing conviction that he had been deceived, that he had been mocked, that he must be freed. Anne continued smiling at the right times. Henry continued complaining to his physicians. Cromwell continued praying that politics could defy disgust. And the quiet truth settled over England like frost. The Queen did not know she was a queen only in name, and the King did not know he was the author of his own disappointment. The candles burned low, the palace slept, and Anne lay awake, not knowing her crown was already cracking. From that point until the month of June, Anne's life became a melody with only two notes, waiting and enduring. She woke in a chamber of cold stone, dressed in garments chosen by others, and ate breakfast without her husband ever sitting beside her. She studied English with a patient tutor, struggling through stiff phrases, and crafted hollow reassurances in letters sent back home. "I am well. Everyone here is very kind." Henry appeared only when protocol demanded it. Feasts, church services, ceremonies. He sat beside her as though separated by an invisible chasm. The nobles whispered, glanced, and murmured. Anne did not understand all the words, but she understood the eyes. Why does the king not go near the queen? Is she flawed? In the evenings they were still escorted to the same bed. The women undressed Anne, wished her good night. The courtiers helped Henry climb onto the mattress, adding crude jokes. Then the door closed, and once again, two bodies lay still, turned away from one another, separated by a silence no one dared to name. Gradually, Anne noticed a shift in the glances cast across the banquet hall. Henry did not look at her, but his eyes rested often on another girl, Catherine Howard, small, 18, bright-eyed, and laughing softly. One day, Catherine entered wearing a ruby heart-shaped brooch. Anne stared, her stomach sinking. It was the wedding gift Henry had given her, the one she had tucked away because he seemed displeased whenever she wore it. Now it rested on the young girl's chest, glittering. A German lady whispered to Anne in their mother tongue, "Please say nothing, Your Grace. Pretend you do not see." From then on, Anne saw Catherine everywhere, sitting nearer at feasts, smiling at the king, receiving necklaces, earrings, trinkets, the very items Anne once believed were hers. One evening, when the hall erupted in laughter at a humorous tale, Anne, out of courtesy, laughed along. Henry turned and said loudly in English, "You do not even understand what they are saying." "Awer." The table fell silent for a single beat. Then the laughter resumed, but inside Anne something snapped. That night, lying beside the man who snored heavily with his back turned to her, Anne no longer asked herself, "What have I done wrong?" She began asking, "If I do as Catherine of Aragon did, as Anne Boleyn did resist, demand justice, where will I end up?" The answer was unmistakable. At the top of the scaffold stairs, she thought of Catherine of Aragon pushed aside, exiled, dying alone. She thought of Anne Boleyn accused, condemned, beheaded. She thought of Jane Seymour dead in childbirth. She thought of the crown resting on her own head, and how sharp its edges suddenly felt. The palace around her breathed with the quiet weight of history, and she recognized that history never favored women who fought. So, in the darkness, she made a silent decision that would save her entire life. If Henry wished to be free of her, she would open the door for him. No tears, no accusations, no trials, no pleas. If the cost of survival was surrender, she would surrender beautifully. June approached, heavy with heat and tension. The court hummed with rumours. Ambassadors exchanged knowing letters. Cromwell watched the Queen with rising dread, realising that her composure, the very thing he once believed useful, now marked the threat to his own survival. Henry avoided her more boldly. Catherine Howard glowed more brightly. And Anne sat straighter, spoke more gently, and smiled with a calm that did not reach her eyes. Every night she folded her hands, breathed slowly, and reminded herself, "I will not die for a man who does not want me." The court mistook her quiet for dullness. The ambassadors mistook her patience for ignorance. But Anne understood something they did not. A woman who accepts defeat on her own terms is never truly defeated. The days drifted like drifting ash. The meals grew quieter. The glances sharpened. The crown felt lighter not because it weighed less, but because she no longer clung to it. She had chosen life, and life would choose her back. And when the month of June finally arrived, England was poised for a change. No one would name aloud a change that would shatter Cromwell, crown Catherine Howard, and place Anne on a path no queen before her had ever walked. The path of survival. When Anne decided she would lose in order to live, the machinery of power began to turn in another direction. By the end of the month of June in the year 1540, during a council meeting like any other, guards entered and placed their hands upon the shoulders of Thomas Cromwell, the man who had once been the mind of the entire kingdom. No one stood. No one breathed too loudly. In the court of Henry, when a man was seized in the middle of a meeting, it meant the end. Cromwell was charged with treason, heresy, and rebellion accusations sufficient to remove the head of any man in England. But the truth was far simpler. He had arranged the marriage that caused Henry to loathe his own wife. And in this court, every fault of the king had to be carried by someone else. News of Cromwell's arrest reached Anne, but no one explained anything. Only one thing was clear. From that day onward, the remaining German attendants who served her disappeared, sent back to their homeland. Anne no longer had anyone who spoke her language, no one to witness what was unfolding, no one to remind her that she had once been a princess of Cleves. She ate in silence, prayed in silence, sat in silence. Each night, she was still led toward the bed where Henry lay distant as a mountain. But now, there was no one left to ask the question that haunted her. Is this truly marriage? Within the thick stone corridors, rumours spread that the king was seeking an annulment, that the marriage had never been consummated, that the queen's body was unsuitable. Physicians were summoned and recorded every word Henry uttered. The smell of fish, the softness of flesh, the wrongness of her appearance. Each sentence, each phrase, became evidence to erase the union. One evening after supper, Anne suddenly understood the most terrifying truth. They did not need her to speak, did not need her agreement, did not need her version of events. They only needed her body as proof. Meanwhile, Cromwell was imprisoned in the Tower of London, writing letters begging for mercy, swearing loyalty, pleading for his life. Henry did not read them. No one survived after making the king feel ashamed. Anne did not know the details, but she felt something like a door closing behind her, and within her chest, a quiet voice whispered, "I have chosen to live. Then I must continue to live, at any cost." The days grew slower, and the stillness around her became heavy. Servants moved differently, bowing lower, speaking less. Ambassadors watched her with an unsettling mixture of pity and anticipation. The palace air held the weight of a storm no one named aloud. Henry stopped attempting to hide his distance. Catherine Howard's presence glimmered brighter, the court leaning toward her like flowers bending to sunlight. Anne walked through rooms where conversation fell away when she entered, where eyes slid past her as though she were fading from sight. Meals became rituals without warmth. Church services became performances without belief. Every gesture Anne made was witnessed, measured, interpreted not as the actions of a queen, but as the movements of a woman already being written out of her own life. Whispers sharpened. Documents were drafted. Advisers nodded gravely in hallways. The king's will stretched across England like a shadow. Anne folded her hands and breathed slowly. She remembered the stories of the queens before her, the exiled, the executed, the dead. She remembered the ruby brooch now resting on Catherine's dress. She remembered the laughter she could not understand, and she understood that survival meant stillness, not resistance, not outrage, not demand. A queen who fought would fall. A queen who yielded might live. Cromwell's fate tightened around him like a noose woven from the king's humiliation. On the 28th day of July, in the year 1540, he would be executed, but Anne did not yet know the date, only the dread. The wedding ring still rested upon her finger, but it felt like an object that belonged to someone else. The crown still hovered over her title, but it no longer belonged to her life. In the quiet of her chamber, she closed her eyes and repeated the only vow that mattered now. If the king wishes to be free, I will not stand in his way. The palace slept. The wind moved through the arches. History waited, and Anne waited with it not to be queen, but to remain alive. A summer morning arrived, and a carriage carried Anne to Richmond. No one spoke the words soft exile, but she felt them. The castle was beautiful, the gardens green, the bedchamber wide, yet it was a place to put her away, like a fragile object no longer useful. Servants bowed, voices gentle, but the silence around her was louder than any decree. Then a delegation of officials appeared. They bowed, spoke in mild tones, but their eyes were cold as steel. They asked Anne, through an interpreter, "Has your grace and the king completed the marriage?" Anne felt her heart sink. She remembered the wedding night, the silence, the turned back, the not understanding. She answered, "No." They asked, "Does your grace believe you are truly the king's wife?" This was not simply a question about marriage, it was a question about survival. She held her breath for a long moment, the air thick and unmoving. Then they told her the rest. If she cooperated, she would have a palace, a title, money, and life. If she did not cooperate, they did not finish the sentence. But she knew the ending of Catherine of Aragon. She knew the ending of Anne Boleyn. She knew the ending of any woman who dared to shame Henry. So she nodded. She signed. She confirmed she had never been a wife. That night, her ladies wept. Anne did not. She simply looked at her hands and whispered inside herself, "I have lived another day." The palace around her seemed to shift. The walls breathed differently. The air tasted thin. The servants moved softly, as though in a house of mourning. The corridors echoed with footsteps that never approached her door. At meals, she sat before food she could not swallow. At prayers, she knelt without knowing what to pray for. At night, she lay in a bed far wider than her courage. The crown she had worn, if only in name, faded like mist at sunrise. She felt lighter and yet more hollow, as though someone had removed her from her own life and placed her somewhere between existence and memory. She thought of Cleves, of the river, of winter air that smelled of pine, of voices that spoke her language. She thought of her mother, of lessons about duty, obedience, silence. She wondered if anyone there knew that she was no longer queen, or if letters would be rewritten before they arrived. The next morning, they called her by a new name. The king's sister, not queen, not wife. A safe role, harmless, neutral. A title designed to keep her close, but out of the way. A title that erased the bed, the vows, the humiliation. A title that allowed Henry to walk free into another marriage, while pretending compassion. Anne felt the weight of it settle upon her shoulders, not heavy like the gold-threaded gown she once wore, but light in a way that stung like being replaced by air. She curtsied when spoken to, smiled gently, and lowered her gaze. The court approved of this version of her quiet, agreeable, invisible. The ambassadors wrote home, noting her composure. The nobles relaxed, sensing no danger. The women who served her dried their tears and tried to imitate her calm. Anne, who had been taught to stand tall, now learned to bow just enough to survive. She walked through gardens where flowers bloomed without scent. She listened to music that did not stir her heart. She watched the river move past the palace, carrying time with it. But in her stillness, there was something new. Not defeat, but calculation. Not pride, but clarity. Not despair, but endurance. She understood that history remembered queens who died, but forgot queens who lived. And she preferred being forgotten. She had escaped the blade without running, without pleading, without war. She had survived a king, a court, a marriage, and a portrait. She had surrendered the crown, and in doing so, kept her life. Night fell softly over Richmond. The candles flickered. The air cooled. Anne closed her eyes and breathed slowly, the way one breathes when slipping into sleep or into a new life. She did not know what would come next, but she knew she would meet it alive. To close the door on the marriage, the court needed final proof that Anne was still a virgin. That meant 3 male physicians would enter her chamber, ask her to lie upon the bed, and touch her body as though she were an object to be inspected. Her ladies tried to soothe her in trembling German. "It will be quick. Do not be afraid, your grace." Horror. But Anne, who had learned to survive through silence, simply lay back and looked up at the canopy above her, as though it were a winter sky. Rough hands, cold eyes, and clinical voices discussed her body in English as though it were a report rather than a person. Unpenetrated, structure intact, no signs of intercourse. They spoke as if she could not hear them, as if she were not present, as if her spirit had already been removed from her flesh. When they left, her ladies burst into tears. One covered her face and whispered in German, "No one deserves this." Anne sat up, took a small sip of wine, and simply said, "I am still alive." Night settled over Richmond. She sat by the window for a long time, watching the green of the garden fade into shadow, listening to the wind move through the leaves. Perhaps for the first time she understood a truth more brutal than Henry himself. To survive, sometimes one must allow others to take something that was never meant to be given. The castle was quiet, yet heavy as though the stones themselves knew what had been taken and what was yet to come. Morning arrived with pale light. The report was submitted. The marriage was declared null. Anne was released from the throne. But she knew this was not freedom. This was merely a more beautiful prison. Her chamber was spacious, yet it felt smaller. Her gowns were soft, yet they felt heavier. Her title was safer, yet it felt emptier. Servants bowed more deeply, as though pity required ceremony. Officials spoke more gently, as though shame required softness. Messages arrived with cautious phrasing, as though the truth required padding. Anne walked through rooms where her footsteps did not echo. She sat at tables where food tasted like nothing. She prayed with lips that moved, but did not form meaning. The crown was gone, yet its absence pressed against her like a bruise. She thought of the night the women stripped away her gown. She thought of Henry turning his back. She thought of physicians writing down her body like a list of evidence. She wondered how a marriage could be erased, not by love or hatred, but by ink. Outside, birds sang as if nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. The court celebrated quietly, relieved, triumphant, satisfied. Henry prepared to move forward, convinced he had restored his dignity. Catherine Howard glimmered like a new coin ready to be spent. And Anne sat with folded hands, breathing slowly, as though each breath confirmed she still existed. In the gardens below, the air shimmered with summer heat. Servants trimmed hedges. Pages carried messages. Musicians practiced for celebrations she would not attend. Anne watched people move, and realized she was no longer one of them. She was something set aside, preserved, displayed, but untouched. A living artifact. A removed queen. A woman rewritten. No executioner's bladder. No exile across the sea. No public disgrace. Only a quiet dismissal, the kind that left no wounds except the kind no one could see. The day passed softly. Evening returned. Candles flickered. Anne touched the place on her finger where a ring had once sat too loosely. She traced the memory of it, not the metal, but the expectation it had represented. She closed her eyes and felt the stillness around her. She had survived the king, the court, the bed, the examination, the annulment. But survival did not feel like triumph. It felt like waiting. Waiting for a life that was still hers, but no longer recognizable. The night deepened, slow and silent, and Anne remained awake, breathing, thinking, existing inside walls that looked like safety and felt like something else entirely. People said Anne was the luckiest of Henry's wives, but if you listen closely, you can hear the chains soft as silk. Anne received Richmond, Hever, and an allowance of £4,000 a year. But with them came conditions. She could not leave England. She could not remarry. She could not tell the truth. She must appear when summoned. She must smile when Henry married another. And only 3 weeks later, Henry married Catherine Howard, the small, bright girl who had once worn Anne's jewels. Anne sent a wedding gift, sent congratulations, and when the court looked at her, they saw a woman, serene. No one knew how long she sat alone that night. But the next morning she dressed beautifully, arranged her hair, and played cards with the ladies, as though nothing had ever been taken from her. People called her foolish, dull, empty, but in truth, Anne had understood a secret no one taught her. In a world where men hold absolute power, the most frightening woman is not the one who resists, but the one who gives men nothing to destroy. Anne became so harmless that no one wished to harm her, and that saved her life. Days in Richmond drifted like soft clouds. She walked through gardens without ownership, sat in chambers without purpose, and listened to musicians play songs meant for ears more beloved than hers. The servants bowed, respectful but distant, as if she were a memory standing upright. Letters from Cleves arrived, full of questions she could not answer honestly. She wrote replies with gentle phrases, careful ink, cautious omission. She learned to craft sentences that felt like curtains letting in light while hiding the room. Heather smelled of orchard and damp grass. Richmond smelled of polished stone and stillness. Anne moved between them like a ghost assigned a schedule. When summoned to court, she smiled. When dismissed, she vanished. Henry did not hate her. He simply forgot her, and being forgotten was safer than being loved by him. Catherine Howard, meanwhile, glittered. Anne watched from a distance, never too near, never too curious, never too invested. She bowed the perfect amount, spoke the perfect softness, withdrew with the perfect timing. The ambassadors wrote home that Anne was content. But contentment is not what lived inside her. What lived inside her was calm calculation, the understanding that breathing quietly was the only armor allowed to women who wished to remain alive. She rode through gardens on gentle horses. She embroidered scenes she never showed anyone. She played cards and pretended not to notice when people cheated to let her win. At night, she sat by the window, hands folded, feeling existence rather than purpose. Not queen, not wife, not mother, just surviving. People assumed survival was easy. It was not. Every morning she woke and chose silence. Every afternoon she chose invisibility. Every evening she chose to remain. Those choices looked small, but they built a fortress no blade could breach. The court stopped fearing her. The king stopped resenting her. History almost stopped noticing her. And in that almost she found safety. Catherine Howard danced through the palace like a flame. The court warmed itself at her brightness. Henry smiled again, believing youth could be borrowed, believing time could be bribed. Anne watched with eyes that understood what Catherine did not. The brighter the flame, the faster the burn. Women whispered that Anne had been humiliated. Men said she was irrelevant. Chroniclers barely mentioned her. But Anne lived. She breathed air that did not smell of fear. She walked corridors without dreading footsteps behind her. She slept without dreaming of swords. And as summer folded into autumn, and autumn into winter, a strange truth shimmered beneath her quiet life. She had escaped the fate of queens by ceasing to be one. The crown had been removed, but her head was still attached. The marriage had been erased, but her pulse continued. The world thought she had lost, but she had won the only victory that mattered, the right to keep living in a world where women like her were not meant to survive. And so she continued, soft as a whisper, present but untouchable, forgettable but enduring, the wife who left the throne and kept her life. Catherine Howard burned bright like fireworks and faded just as quickly. Rumors began to stir, then letters surfaced. Then people who had known her before she became queen stepped forward, whispering, confessing, accusing. Servants spoke of past lovers. Old acquaintances delivered statements. Names were written down, dates were recorded. The glitter that had once enchanted the court now turned sharp, cutting through her illusions. Henry, who had felt young again because of her, now raged like a wounded beast. The men suspected of involvement with her were seized, tortured, and executed, their heads set upon London Bridge, left for the crows to tear. Catherine was imprisoned, trembling, weeping, begging for mercy. She was only 21 years old. On a winter morning in the year 1542, she was led to the scaffold where Anne Boleyn had died. Her legs were so weak that she needed to be supported. Her final words disappeared into the cold wind. One stroke of the axe and her life ended. The news reached Anne at Richmond. Her servant delivered the message in a quiet voice. Anne simply nodded and said she would pray for Catherine's soul. But when she stepped into the chapel, no one knew what she prayed for. Perhaps pity, perhaps fear, perhaps gratitude that she had been made not beautiful, not fiery, not dangerous. When she walked out, a lady-in-waiting asked in a trembling voice, "Your Grace, are you well?" Anne smiled softly and answered, "Today, I am still alive." And that was the first moment her attendants understood. Anne was not passive. Anne was a survivor. Richmond felt different after that morning. The air seemed quieter, as though even the walls had heard the blade fall. The servants moved with a new respect, not dramatic, not spoken, but perceptible, like the shift of a tide. Anne sat near the window, watching frost cling to the edges of the garden. She thought of Catherine Howard's laughter, the youth that had danced through the court, the jewels that once had been hers. She thought of the short distance between admiration and execution. She thought of how quickly affection could turn into accusation. Henry did not summon her. No one asked her opinion. History did not record her feelings. But she understood something the world rarely admits. Beauty can be fatal. Charm can be fatal. Desire can be fatal. And being overlooked can be a shield. In the months that followed, Anne became even quieter, even gentler, even softer around the edges. She was present, but never central, visible, but never threatening. She attended court when required, bowed with grace, departed with dignity. The ambassadors reported that she seemed content. But contentment was not the word. Endurance was. Henry remarried again, choosing Catherine Parr. She was older, wiser, careful in speech. Anne observed from afar, recognizing another woman who understood that survival in Henry's world required stillness, not passion. The court shifted once more. Politics changed. Alliances moved like teeters. But Anne remained untouched. People called her fortunate. They said she had escaped. They said she was blessed. But blessings are rarely so quiet, and survival rarely so gentle. Anne walked the corridors knowing what others did not. She had lived because she had given the king nothing to push against. No fire to extinguish. No pride to shatter. No ambition to punish. And so she continued breathing softly, sleeping peacefully, waking each morning with the simple miracle of still being alive. Years later, when people spoke of Henry's wives, they spoke of tragedy, betrayal, death, childbirth, blood, execution. But when they spoke of Anne of Cleves, they paused. There was no scandal, no blade, no downfall, only endurance. Only a woman who learned the quiet art of stepping aside without disappearing. Only a life that stretched far beyond the king who once claimed her. And if you listen closely, even now, across the centuries, you can still hear it. Not the scream of execution, not the roar of accusation, but the soft whisper of breath. Today, I am still alive. After the death of Catherine Howard, the court exhaled as though a tight cord had finally loosened. Henry became quieter, slower, more exhausted. The feasts grew fewer, laughter fractured into coughing. And within that hollowed space, something no one expected began to form. Anne and Princess Mary grew close. Mary, the child who had been stripped of her title, forced to call her mother a mistress, cast out of the court, and turned into a pawn of politics and religion. Mary, the one who understood humiliation, who understood silence, who understood what it meant to survive inside a palace that could kill her at any moment. When Mary visited Anne at Richmond, the two sat drinking light wine, speaking in simple Latin, for it was the only shared language they both commanded. No one recorded their conversation. But the servants said that sometimes they laughed softly, like two people who shared a secret the world was too blind to touch. They played cards, embroidered linen, spoke of books, of homeland, of things women were never permitted to say aloud, that this court had devoured too many souls, that beauty died, obedience died, loyalty died, that sometimes survival was the only victory. Anne had no children. Mary had no mother. Two women deprived of what should have been theirs found a small family in each other. Mary arrived, wrapped in a history of wounds. She had watched her mother, Catherine of Aragon, fade and die in isolation. She had watched Anne Boleyn rise and fall. She had watched men write her life in ink she could not hold. She had been told to forget, to accept, to obey. Anne listened. Not as queen, not as rival, not as spectator, but as someone who understood that loss could be quiet and still fatal. They spoke of faith without preaching. They spoke of power without ambition. They spoke of fear without trembling. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, the way only two people who have lived through storms can sit without needing to fill the air. Richmond's windows overlooked gardens that swayed gently in the wind. The river glimmered with pale sunlight. The world outside continued, unaware that inside, two women stitched themselves back together with shared understanding. Servants noticed the change. Anne smiled more softly. Mary breathed more evenly. The court did not comment, because the court did not see. Only the women who served them whispered, in kitchens and corridors, that something rare was happening. Companionship without envy, affection without danger, kinship without threat. And when Mary rose to leave Richmond, she always turned back to look once more. A servant once asked her why. Mary answered very softly, because she is the only one who escaped my father. In that world, those words were the highest form of reverence. Anne watched Mary depart, cloaked and escorted, carrying a dignity carved from suffering. She saw in Mary a reflection of herself, a woman shaped by men's decisions, yet somehow unbroken. Days passed gently. Seasons shifted. The court transformed again, as it always did. Henry remarried this time to Catherine Parr. She was careful, intelligent, measured. Anne observed without jealousy, without ache, without longing, because she understood now that she had stepped outside the story that consumed other women. She was no longer prey to affection or expectation. She was no longer a symbol of alliance or beauty. She was no longer a crown to be worn or removed. She was simply Anne alive, breathing, untouched by the blade that had taken others. At Richmond, she walked through shaded paths, her gown brushing the gravel. She read scripture slowly, not for salvation, but for calm. She listened to music played softly on lute or viol, letting the notes drift like dandelion seeds. She lived, day after day, quietly, and in a world that had killed queens for less. That was astonishing. Sometimes at night, she thought of the ship crossing the winter sea. She thought of the portrait. She thought of the marriage bed. She thought of the examination. And she realized she no longer felt pain, only distance. Mary continued to visit. Anne continued to welcome her. Two women surviving the same man. Two ghosts who refused to die. History would not write about these afternoons. Chronicles would not record their laughter. Biographers would not mention their bond. But here, in the quiet breathing of the palace walls, it existed soft, steady, undeniable. And it carried Anne forward, not as a queen, not as a disgrace, but as something far rarer. A woman who lived, and lived, and lived. Time passed like a candle burning slowly. Henry aged so quickly that even he could not keep up with the truth of it. The ulcer on his leg swelled, oozing yellow-black fluid, the smell rising so sharply that attendants covered their noses. He no longer rode horses, no longer danced, no longer resembled the lion Europe had once feared. Sometimes, Anne was summoned to court. She stood at a distance, knelt just enough, smiled in the proper measure, and asked about his health in gentle English. Henry looked at her longer than he used to, as though trying to remember who she had once been in his life. Then he turned away, breath heavy, and ordered that she be sent back. The palace grew quieter each season. Footsteps softened, candles burned earlier, the music faded into memory. Those who had survived multiple queens began moving through the halls like elderly ghosts, waiting for the next shift in power. And through it all, Anne remained untouched, neither beloved nor despised, simply present, breathing. On a cold night in the year 1547, Henry's candle finally went out. There was no roar, no grand final speech, no thunderous farewell, only a breath that grew slower, heavier, and then stopped. Europe heard the news. Ambassadors sent reports. Church bells rang. But at Richmond, Anne simply placed her hand over her chest and inhaled deeply as though someone had opened a window after many years. No one asked for her feelings. No one recorded her reaction. But the servants said that on that night, Anne ate better than usual and went to sleep early, without sleeping draughts, without nightmares, without the shadow of a monster pressing on her chest. Henry died at the age of 55. Anne lived 16 more years. The court shifted again, like a great machine changing gears. Edward, the boy born from Jane Seymour, became king. Mary, the daughter who had visited Anne, became queen after him. Then came Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the girl Henry once wished had never been born. And through each reign, Anne remained safe. She attended Mary's coronation, wrapped in dignity. The crowds cheered for the new queen, but they also whispered about the woman standing quietly nearby, the woman who had escaped the fate of queens. Mary welcomed her with warmth, offering honours and respect that the world thought impossible. For the first time, Anne felt something like belonging not to a throne, not to a marriage, but to her own continued existence. She walked through gardens without fear. She sat by the fire without dread. She embroidered without trembling hands. No one measured her beauty. No one inspected her body. No one demanded her loyalty. She was finally what she had never been allowed to be, herself. The years drifted softly. Seasons rolled by like waves that never crashed. Anne aged gently, without the violence that had marked the lives of the other wives. She heard stories of Catherine of Aragon's lonely death. She remembered Anne Boleyn's execution. She prayed for Jane Seymour, who died giving the king the son he wanted. She thought of Catherine Howard, young and terrified, and she nodded with quiet respect toward Catherine Parr, who survived Henry but not the life that came after. Anne alone remained not ruined, not erased, not broken. She became a figure that history struggled to categorize. Not tragedy, not triumph. Something quieter and therefore harder to destroy. In the summer of the year 1557, Anne fell ill at Chelsea. She lay in a bed that did not smell of fear, surrounded by servants who were not watching for scandal, attended by physicians who did not report her body to the king. There was no sword, no accusation, no annulment, no whispers of treason, only breath, and then no breath. She was about 41 years old. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's wives to rest there. In a world where women were either replaced or executed, Anne had found a third ending. She lived, not gloriously, not loudly, not triumphantly, but fully enough to outlast a king. And if you lie still for a moment, you can almost hear it softer than silk, fainter than candle smoke, steadier than a heartbeat fading into night. She survived. In the years that followed, Anne lived like a wealthy, independent lady, unmonitored, unpressured, untouched by the demands that had crushed so many others. She took gentle hunts, played chess, practiced slow dances, read her prayers in the morning, and drank apple wine in the evening. The court changed around her like a shifting tapestry. Edward took the throne, she sent gifts. Then Mary became Queen Anne, attended the coronation, placed in a seat of honour. Then Elizabeth rose to power. Anne wrote a letter of congratulations in English that was almost perfect, the language that had once felt like stone in her mouth now flowing like quiet water. No one called her the Flanders mare anymore. No one mocked her body. No one asked about her wedding night. Anne became something rare, a woman who had been the wife of Henry VIII, yet whom no one wished to bury in memory. People described her as gentle, easy to live with, sometimes laughing softly over cards, her eyes sad but never bitter. When she fell mildly ill, she rested in a chamber with windows that opened toward the garden. The servants said she liked to hear the wind, and during her afternoon naps, she looked like someone who had never been wounded by history at all. If any ghost followed Anne, it was not Henry. It was the version of herself in Holbein's portrait, the woman she had never been allowed to become. The portrait had promised poise, elegance, grace carved like marble. It had promised a queen, a consort, a symbol. And yet, the real Anne had lived something far stranger. A life freed by rejection, a fate carved not by triumph, but by dismissal. Visitors who met her later in life wrote that she enjoyed music played on lute and viol, that she walked slowly through orchards at Hever, that she fed birds with crumbs from her breakfast tray. They noted that she preferred warm colours, that she liked embroidered cushions, that she rarely spoke of the past, and if she did, it was with a softness that made listeners wonder whether she had rewritten her own memories into something less sharp. Time treated her more gently than it had treated Henry, or Catherine of Aragon, or Anne Boleyn, or Jane Seymour, or Catherine Howard, or even Catherine Parr, who survived the king only to die in childbirth later. Anne alone was permitted to age. She watched seasons turn like pages. Spring orchards, summer heat, autumn leaves, winter frost, and then beginning again. She received visitors from Cleves who bowed nervously, unsure how to address a woman who was once queen but no longer was. She reassured them with calm words, reminding them that she was comfortable, safe, and peaceful. Three things no one had ever expected for a discarded royal bride. Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman who had been executed before her, treated Anne with courtesy and favour. It is said that Elizabeth admired her composure, her lack of intrigue, her refusal to seek influence. Anne recognised in Elizabeth the sharpness of survival, the steel hidden beneath silk. Some evenings Anne sat by candlelight and reread the letter in which she had agreed to the annulment. The ink had not faded. Her signature was steady. She understood that those strokes of the quill had been her salvation, more powerful than any crown, more protective than any guard. No chronicler recorded her regrets. No poet mourned her losses. No preacher condemned her choices. Instead, she faded gently. Not erased, not resented, simply allowed. Her breath slowed over the years like tides withdrawing. Her steps became quiet, like snow falling. Her presence became light, like a curtain swaying in a summer breeze. And yet, beneath that softness lay something unbreakable. The knowledge that she had survived a king, a system, a history that consumed women whole. Holbein's portrait remained polished, poised, perfect. But Anne's true legacy was quieter. Not beauty, not tragedy, not power, but endurance. In a world built to crush her, she lived a life long enough to watch that world change. And when she closed her eyes for the final time, it was not under a sword, not in exile, not in disgrace, but in a bed warmed by sunlight, surrounded by servants who respected her, in a country that no longer feared her existence. She died not as a queen, but as something rarer, a woman whom history could not kill. In the summer of the year 1557, Anne's breath began to shorten. There was no blood, no screams, no confessions, only a body that gradually tired, gradually slowed, gradually released its hold on the world. Priests performed the rites. Ladies in waiting held her hand. The windows were open, and the air that drifted in smelled of grass, warmed by sunlight. When they asked whether she wished to send any final words, she simply shook her head and whispered, "I have been at peace." None of Henry's other wives had a death like that. Not exiled, not beheaded, not killed by childbirth, not hated by her husband until the moment he died. Catherine of Aragon had died alone at Kimbolton Castle, separated from her daughter, denied her title. Anne Boleyn had died on a scaffold, the sword flashing beneath a grey sky. Jane Seymour had died days after giving Henry the son he wanted more than her life. Catherine Howard had died trembling, barely more than a girl, at the same place where Anne Boleyn fell. Catherine Parr had survived Henry, only to die in childbirth later. Anne alone slipped away like a candle that had simply finished burning. Her body was taken to Westminster Abbey, a resting place of kings, something that had never happened for a woman once dismissed from the throne. The procession was dignified, quiet, respectful. No crowds shouting, no rumours swirling, no political tension, only the soft shuffle of footsteps and the murmured prayers of clergy. There was no grand monument, no towering statue, no legendary inscription, just silence. But sometimes, silence is the only proof that someone has won. The abbey stones received her gently. She was laid to rest, not as a discarded queen, not as a scandal, not as a tragedy, but as a woman who had slipped through history's clenched teeth without being broken. Those who remembered her spoke of calmness, of softness, of a presence that never demanded space, yet occupied it fully, of a woman who bowed just enough to live and stood just enough to remain herself. Years later, chroniclers almost forgot to include her. Historians struggled to label her. Playwrights ignored her because she offered no blood, no seduction, no spectacle. But perhaps that was her last quiet triumph. Anne had learned something most people never do, that survival is not always loud, and peace is not always celebrated, and endurance is not always carved into stone. Sometimes it exists in the soft breath of a woman who was expected to die, but lived instead. Visitors to Westminster walk past her resting place without realizing who lies there. Guides speak more loudly about queens who bled, who burned, who fell. But somewhere beneath the stone, Anne rests untouched by the stories that consumed the others. If ghosts walk the abbey at night, hers would not scream or rattle chains. She would move quietly, like a breeze across old marble. No portrait shows her as she truly became. No history book captures the softness of her victory. No legend carries her name with fire. But if you pause long enough, if you listen in the hush between footfalls, you might feel it. The echo of a life that refused to be ruined. Anne of Cleves, once a bargaining chip, once a bride unwanted, once a queen erased on paper, outlived the king who rejected her, outlasted the court that mocked her, and departed the world in peace. And so her story ends not with a sword, nor with a scream, but with a breath that faded gently, leaving behind only the quiet proof that in a world designed to destroy her, she lived, and that was enough. Now you understand why I told you to pull the blanket closer at the beginning. Because this story does not shout, does not spray blood, does not echo with the chop of an axe, does not rattle prison bars. It carries only a whispered lesson. Not everyone who survives is a coward. Some survive because they see what others cannot. Anne did not resist like Catherine of Aragon, standing firm until her dignity became a cage. She did not blaze and fall like Anne Boleyn, brilliant enough to be worshipped, brilliant enough to be killed. She did not die of youth and carelessness like Catherine Howard, 21 and trembling before the blade. She did not wither in childbirth like Jane Seymour, praised for virtue as life slipped away. She did not drown in sorrow like Catherine Parr, surviving the king only to be consumed by the life that followed. Anne chose something different. Anne chose the path most people never recognize, the path of becoming untouchable, by refusing to be destructible. And in Henry's court, a place where love could kill you, where beauty could kill you, where obedience could kill you, that was the most frightening thing of all. When you close your eyes tonight, remember this. Sometimes victory is not sitting on the throne, but walking away from it with your soul intact. Anne was not celebrated, but she was not erased. She was not adored, but she was not destroyed. She was not crowned, but she was not crushed. History tried to turn her into a footnote, a quiet name between louder tragedies, a pause between queens who bled and queens who screamed. Chroniclers yawned over her. Playwrights ignored her. Textbooks skimmed past her. But the more lightly they wrote her, the clearer her outline became. Because absence can be a kind of presence. Because silence can be a kind of echo. Because a life that leaves no scars is sometimes the loudest defiance. Think of the portrait painted by Holbein, the one that brought her across the sea, the one that sealed her fate. People stared at that smooth face and believed it told the truth. But the real Anne was not in the wood and pigment. The real Anne was the woman who lived 17 years longer than her king. The real Anne was the one who stepped away rather than stepped forward. The real Anne was the one who saw the trap and quietly sat beside it instead of in it. The real Anne was the one who learned that disappearing from danger is not the same as disappearing from life. And so when the world tried to make her shadow, she became something softer, steadier, harder to kill. A quiet fact. There are people like that in every age. People who are called timid when they are wise. People who are called dull when they are careful. People who are called forgettable because they refuse to set themselves on fire just to be seen. Perhaps you have been one of them. Perhaps there has been a moment, or a year, or a lifetime, when silence was the only way to stay whole. If so, remember Anne. Remember the woman history tried to soften into dust, but who kept breathing anyway. Remember the woman they tried to laugh at, but who outlived the man who laughed. Remember the woman they tried to hide, but whose survival became the final word in a story full of endings. Because sometimes the greatest proof that someone lived is not a monument, not a statue, not a legend told in firelight, but the simple, stubborn truth that no matter how hard the world tried to break her, she remained. So as you drift into sleep tonight, let the thought settle next to you like a second blanket. In a world that rewards noise, there is a rare and secret power in living quietly, steadily, fully, and walking away whole.